In a small town in Ohio, the streets were quiet, the lawns trimmed, the neighbors polite. Carol Jennings, 65, was known as the sweetest grandma on the block. But sweet doesn't mean innocent. Behind closed doors, Carol had a secret, a dangerous one, a secret named Tyler, the charming 27-year-old neighbor who had just moved in next door. Their friendship started with shared cups of tea, small talk about gardening, and then it turned into something else, something addictive, something deadly. What started as a forbidden romance would soon spiral into betrayal, obsession, and eventually a gruesome death that would shake the entire neighborhood. This is not fiction. This is a true crime story, and it begins in the most unexpected way. Carol Jennings had spent most of her life being someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's grandmother, but now with her children living far away and her husband Richard growing increasingly distant, she found herself spending more and more time alone. Days passed slowly. Her routines were predictable, until one afternoon, a moving truck rolled up next door. That's when she met Tyler Moore. Tyler was 27, friendly, handsome, and recently divorced. He had rented the house next door to start fresh. Carol welcomed him with a pie and polite conversation. Tyler, grateful and warm, saw her as a kind soul in an unfamiliar town. At first, they exchanged small favors. He helped her fix her porch light. She brought him home-cooked meals. Then came longer talks in the garden, jokes, shared music playlists, walks in the evening. To Tyler, Carol was refreshingly honest, something he hadn't felt in a while. To Carol, Tyler made her feel young again, alive. She began dressing nicer, laughing louder, waiting by the window when he came home from work. They both told themselves it was harmless, just neighbors, just friends. But the heart doesn't follow rules, and soon a line would be crossed, one they could never uncross. Tyler arrived with wet hair, his flannel shirt clinging to his arms. Carol laughed as she handed him a towel, teasing him for not bringing an umbrella. He smiled, a long, quiet smile that lingered a second too long. They sat at the kitchen table, eating her famous chicken pot pie, steam rising between them. The conversation drifted from the weather to music to regrets. Carol confessed how she once dreamed of traveling the world, but gave it all up to raise a family. Tyler talked about his failed marriage, how it ended not with a scream but with silence. Their eyes locked. Something unspoken passed between them. Carol stood to refill his tea, her hand brushing his shoulder. He reached up, just lightly, to touch her fingers. It was an innocent gesture, but it was loaded. She paused. He looked up. And then, without warning, he stood. The kiss wasn't explosive. It was tentative, hesitant, almost as if they were testing the edges of something forbidden. But the moment their lips touched, something inside Carol shattered. The decades of feeling unwanted, overlooked, and dismissed vanished in an instant. She felt seen again. They pulled away, breathless, shocked, guilty. "I'm sorry," she whispered, eyes wide. Tyler shook his head. "Don't be." From that day forward, things changed. The casual lunches became secret rendezvous. The playful texts turned into flirtatious messages sent in the dead of night. Carol found herself checking the window at 5 p.m. sharp, waiting for his car to pull in. She would smooth her dress, fix her hair, and pretend it was all accidental. They started meeting in Tyler's backyard, just beyond the hedges where no one could see. Whispers turned into touches. Touches became embraces. But the more they fed the fire, the harder it became to hide the smoke. And soon the whispers in the neighborhood began. Carol's husband, Richard, noticed she was glowing in ways she hadn't in years. Her phone was always on silent. She was humming again. Something didn't feel right, and the day he followed her was the day everything unraveled. He noticed the perfume, the new clothes, the sudden interest in putting on makeup. Not for him, but seemingly for someone else. He'd hear her laugh softly to herself while texting. And then there was Tyler, always around, always helping, always smiling that too perfect smile. One morning, Richard decided to stay home from his usual fishing trip. Quietly, no warning, just stayed. Carol had already left. "To run errands," she said. but her car was parked 2 blocks away. That's when he saw it. Carol in the backyard of the neighbor's house, laughing. Close. Too close. Tyler leaned in. She touched his arm, and for a moment, their heads tilted in that unmistakable way. Richard's heart dropped. He didn't confront her that day. He couldn't. Instead, he let the anger simmer. That night, the tension in the Jennings home was unbearable. Carol noticed his silence. She asked if something was wrong. He just nodded and muttered, "I'm fine." But he wasn't, not even close. The next morning, Richard began digging. He looked through her phone, her laptop, found texts that confirmed what he feared. Messages like, "You make me feel alive again. Let's run away. I can't stop thinking about you." He didn't sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling, fists clenched, visions of betrayal swirling in his mind. Not just betrayal, humiliation. To be cheated on by your wife with a much younger man next door. It was the kind of wound that cut deep, not just in the heart, but in the pride. And when pride bleeds, it screams for revenge. The day started quiet. Carol had baked a pie and promised Tyler she'd bring it over later. Richard, meanwhile, stayed in the garage, alone, silent, brooding. But inside him, a storm was gathering. At 6:45 p.m., Carol slipped out the back door with the pie in hand. She walked the short path between their houses and knocked on Tyler's door. Tyler greeted her with a grin. "You didn't have to bake again?" he said. "I wanted to," she replied, her eyes glowing. They stepped inside. The pie went to the kitchen counter. The conversation turned playful. Neither of them noticed the figure watching through the fence. Richard. He had followed, quietly, carefully. And this time, he wasn't leaving without answers. He knocked. Carol froze. Tyler opened the door, surprised. Richard didn't speak. He simply looked at both of them, then stepped inside. The tension was electric. "I know everything," Richard said coldly. Carol stammered. "Rich, I—" "Save it," he growled. "I read the messages. I saw the looks." Tyler raised his hands. "Mr. Jennings, I didn't mean—" But Richard snapped. "You didn't mean to sleep with my wife?" That's when it happened. There was a scuffle, brief but violent. A knife from the kitchen counter, a shout, a scream, and then silence. When the police arrived, Carol was hysterical. Tyler lay bleeding on the kitchen tiles. Richard stood frozen, his hands red, his breathing shallow. "It was an accident," he kept saying, but no one believed it was. Not after they found the kitchen knife still clutched in his hand. But something didn't add up. Detectives reviewed the scene. The pie was untouched. The knife clean, except for the blood. No fingerprints but his. Carol was in another room, crying uncontrollably. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she kept saying. "I just wanted to feel loved again." When questioned, Carol insisted Tyler never acted aggressively. "He was scared," she said. "Scared when Richard came in like a storm." The medical report confirmed it. Tyler had defensive wounds, bruises on his wrists, a single fatal stab to the abdomen. The detectives knew they were looking at a crime of passion, but motive wasn't enough. They needed to untangle the lies. Richard told them Carol had begged him to come confront Tyler, that she was done with the affair. But Carol denied that entirely. "Richard was spying on me. I never asked him to come," she sobbed. "I was going to tell him the truth, but he beat me to it." Meanwhile, neighbors began to speak up. They had noticed Richard acting strangely in the days before. One neighbor reported hearing shouting late at night. Another had seen Richard parked down the street, watching the house. In his second interview, Richard cracked. "I loved her," he said. 42 years, and he took her from me." There it was, the motive, the rage, the confession. And when the trial came, the courtroom would hear everything, from the text messages to the surveillance footage, to the final scream caught on a neighbor's security camera. But the real question wasn't whether Richard killed Tyler. It was why Carol let it go so far. And in the next chapter, that question would haunt her forever. Inside the courtroom, Richard sat at the defense table, dressed in a navy suit. His face, once rugged and calm, was now pale and hollow. Across the aisle, Carol sat alone, her hands trembling. The prosecution laid out the case that Richard Jennings, driven by jealousy and wounded pride, had entered Tyler Moore's home with intent to confront and ultimately kill the man having an affair with his wife. They presented the text. They showed surveillance footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera capturing Richard entering Tyler's home at 6:53 p.m. And then, 12 minutes later, Carol running out screaming for help. The medical examiner testified that the stab wound was delivered at close range, likely during a struggle. But the position of the wound and bruising suggested Tyler was trying to escape, not fight. Then came the most anticipated moment, Carol's testimony. She walked to the stand slowly. All eyes turned to her. She paused, took a breath, then spoke. "I loved my husband," she said, "but I was lonely. For years I felt like I disappeared inside my own home. Tyler was kind. He listened. He never tried to steal me away. We were foolish, but it wasn't evil. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. I never thought Richard would." Her voice cracked. She covered her face. The courtroom was silent. Richard looked at her. Not with hatred, but with sorrow. The kind of sorrow only betrayal can shape. Then came the defense. They argued temporary insanity, that Richard acted in a fit of passion, unable to control himself after discovering the affair. They painted him as a man broken by betrayal, not a cold-blooded killer. But the jury didn't buy it. After 3 days of deliberation, they returned with a guilty verdict: second-degree murder. Richard was sentenced to 25 years to life in a state prison. As the judge read the sentence, Carol buried her face in her hands. The courtroom emptied slowly. Reporters rushed to capture her photo. She said nothing. She simply stood in the hallway, staring at the rain through the glass doors. Her husband was going to prison. Tyler was dead, and her life, once filled with garden walks and quiet dinners, would never be the same again. But the tragedy wasn't over, because what came after the trial would leave the town haunted for years to come. In the weeks following Richard's conviction, the once vibrant woman who filled her home with laughter and lemon pie now barely left the house. The curtains stayed drawn. The front yard, once manicured with loving care, turned wild with weeds. The neighbors who once smiled and waved now crossed the street in silence. She was no longer Carol from next door. She was the woman who destroyed 2 lives. The town of Briar Hollow, known for its quiet charm and close-knit community, couldn't stop talking. Whispers filled the grocery store aisles. She cheated with the young neighbor. Her husband snapped. She brought this on herself. Carol's children, 2 grown daughters living out of state, were devastated. One stopped speaking to her altogether. The other called once, saying only, "We don't know who you are anymore, Mom." She hung up before Carol could respond. And Richard? He sat in Grafton Correctional Institution, where days melted into gray sameness. He refused visitors, even from Carol. When she sent a letter, he mailed it back, unopened. In a local interview, the prosecutor said, "This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a tragedy born from years of silence, loneliness, and choices that spiraled beyond control." Tyler Moore's funeral was held 3 days after the verdict. His parents, shattered, refused to speak publicly. But in a private statement to the court, his mother wrote, "We lost our son because 2 people couldn't control themselves, and one man thought violence would make the pain go away." In the months that followed, Carol tried to rebuild. She volunteered at a local shelter, attended therapy, walked to the park alone, where she used to go with Richard every Sunday. But nothing felt right. Nothing ever would. One day she returned home to find a brick through her window. A note tied to it read, "Murderer's wife." Except she wasn't a wife anymore. She had become a widow of the living. Her story, once whispered behind hedges, now existed as a cautionary tale, a ghost that wandered the sidewalks of Briar Hollow. And though the case faded from the headlines, the scars it left, on a family, on a community, and on one woman's soul, would never truly disappear. Carol wasn't a monster, Richard wasn't born a killer, and Tyler was just trying to start over. But when emotion festers in silence, when people bury their needs, deny their desires, and let wounds rot under politeness, something darker begins to take root. Loneliness can be invisible. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It sits at dinner tables with empty chairs. It creeps into bed at night when the other side is cold. And if we're not careful, it turns us into people we swore we'd never become. Carol longed to feel alive. Richard longed to feel respected. Tyler longed to feel connection. But what they got was death, prison, and a life no one would envy. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's this. Talk before you explode. Listen before you walk away. And love before it's too late. Because when affection turns to secrecy, when silence turns to suspicion, and when love turns to rage, that's when the curtain falls. Not just on a relationship, but on everything. And in the end, the cost of loneliness wasn't just heartbreak. It was a life lost and another wasted behind bars.